But if we could bring it to where both the person who said something racist, whatever they are, and the person who was said to are working together to listen and work through it, it might be, I don't know. It's just me talking.
So what's your greatest frustration in this work?
It's like the greatest, it's like that double-edged sword. So when I'm teaching, because I teach a senior seminar on what I just call it communication and diversity. And it's a lot of like everyday conversations where we start with just like where race and ethnicity come up, maybe among like racially diverse friend groups and like humorous situations, or like acknowledging cultural norms and things like that. And then we eventually move into talking about racism. And something I really enjoy about the class is that students, sometimes their minds are blown because maybe they haven't been exposed to different kinds of identities or communication before. And all the data and studies we look at are everyday conversation among like, a lot of them are among high school and college youth. And so it's very like real for the students to think, oh, wow, this is how people talk to each other. This is fun. This is interesting. But on the other hand, one of the biggest frustrations that I had is when I teach about like racist discourse, and I'm teaching them about ways that one way of being racist is denying it and saying, oh, it's crazy. It never happens. People just think it happens when it doesn't. I'm teaching this. And then in the classroom, people do those things because they don't want to talk about it. And I'm just like, you're denying the thing, just like in the read, and so that sometimes can get frustrating because it's like, I have to be the teacher and get people to learn. But at the same time, I often have diverse classrooms where if I don't correct the people saying racism isn't a problem, then I'm not protecting like the minority students who are probably sitting there like it is. So it's an interesting thing that I have to manage among all of the students. And then sometimes I feel just as a minority myself, as a woman of color, I'm doing a lot of balancing of being like seeming not angry or not scary. So then people can talk about things. But at the same time, having to hold people accountable and say, no, that's not okay. So there's a lot going on in there, and that it can be frustrating when it goes wrong, because when you're in charge and something goes wrong, then you feel like you could have done something different.
I'm interested in the classroom example. How do you take that out of the classroom and make it global? How do we change our behavior? How do we change the way we talk to each other? There's lots of discussion about the world's become so polarized and run by Google to reinforce any position that we want. How do we get beyond those barriers where we have real, heartfelt conversations?
That's a lot of work. And I mean, it's multi-pronged. And I really like to read like Ijo Maluo's So You Want to Talk About Race, or Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, and a lot of like the Black scholars and authors that or a lot of Roxane Gay's work too, and just thinking about, lots of different angles on drawing on their expertise. And so I tend to look at it that way, but I can talk about from my personal standpoint as a professor who has only so many resources. Like I think, when I teach my students about it, I know that a little bit they're exposed to something and thinking about things. And even when things go wrong or awkward in class, they think about it more and they notice it more outside of class than if things went well and it glazed over. So I'd like to think that those are small changes. And maybe it's also because the first time I was exposed to lots of kinds of viewpoints was when I was in college and a little bit in graduate school. So I like to think that teaching helps a lot. And then, of course, there's lots of public academic work, like, academics who write op-eds, who do like the anti-racism trainings that are actually informed by communication theory. And not just popular ways of what we think that we communicate like, but actually looking at what we actually communicate like. So I think using communication theory to inform these trainings. And it's difficult because there's a big difference between when you have like the safe space of a classroom or a training where you're prepared and the tools are in your back pocket, to where you're just walking around and someone says something, or you're at like a Thanksgiving dinner and your partner's relative says something and you're like, I'm going to ruin this dinner. If I say, hey, that's not okay, I'm ruining a dinner, so what do I do here? And it's like, well, maybe your partner can yell at their relative because it's their relative and not your relative. So like that's hard. And I guess so I see my personal role as just, I do the teaching. I'm trying to be more publicly, like talk about my work and talk about some of the findings a little bit more. I think a lot of what we're trying to do in that group I mentioned, the EMCA for Racial Justice group, is to, collect a lot of data where racism is happening, get findings about strategies like categorization, like preference agreement, like lots of others. And then design kinds of workshops. They're saying, how can we use these findings to help give people actual tips of like, these are conversational moves that you can do or not do to get in and around those things. And these are conversational moves that you should avoid, that we often see people jump to, but don't do that.
No, I think that's great advice, because if we can learn to not continually make the same mistakes in our conversations and we can change them, the outcome might be different.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how to frame this question, but I'm curious, in a backdrop of U.S. chaos, what's going on in relationship to the work you do? How do you feel?
It's really rough to see all of this, because I've been doing this work for like maybe over 10 years now. And one of the books that I really liked that I read early on in grad school was Jane Hill's Everyday Language of White Racism. And also Eduardo Bonilla Silva's Racism Without Colorblind Racism, Racism Without Racists. And both of the books kind of make the argument that we think racism is over, but it happens in all these implicit ways. And even though it all seems nice, like there's all of these kinds of things that happen, that just because they aren't overt, I hate you, go back to your country, use of slurs, doesn't mean that there isn't racism. And now I feel like we've come to a point where people are doing the very overt, like, forms of racism again, and they don't care. Like they're, and there's, there's the rise of people who will openly say they're white nationalists. There's the right, so there's a lot going on that I think was always lurking, but now is becoming more overt. And then we see things like the riots at the Capitol and stuff like that, or like the Unite the Right thing in Charlottesville, and people emboldened to come out and, and do violent actions and say very overtly racist things that often accompany those actions. And I am, on the one hand, it's like interesting from an analytic standpoint to see how like the different strategies are embedded in like the broader socio-political context of what's going on in a place. But on the other hand, it's just kind of sad where I'm like, oh, like I thought it was bad before when people thought it wasn't a problem, but it is. But now it's like, it's all, it seems worse to me. But
yeah, no, I wonder if we can learn how to ask beautiful questions, if we can learn how to open up and dig deeper, that, we can change the way we feel, the way we think, the way we converse with each other. There are more people talking about the need for systemic change. And maybe this is the right path.
Yes, that is like the positive thing is that more people are energized to be anti-racist activists. And there's so many ways to do that. And so that is one positive thing that's come out of all the very violent, overtly violent things. I agree. And I think it's interesting about you talk about being in media and like the way you design questions to like open things up. Like one of the other current event data sessions I did with that racial justice group was recently there was a good Journal of American Medical Association podcast where they talked about structural racism and or systemic racism, and the host like kept framing the questions in terms of like, oh, it's not really, that didn't really happen, or I said this, but I feel, I'm not a racist, and just kind of framed it in that way. And the guest actually came on to say, this is what systemic racism is, this is how it works. But because of the way the host framed the question, the guest had to kind of work within it and be like, oh, no, it's okay, but we can talk about it this way. And so a lot of what we talked about in the group was like, when you have this genre of a podcast where maybe it's supposed to be a nice conversation, and there's a preference for agreement with the previous person or alignment or affiliation with the other person that you're talking to, then if you have to say, well, we're not here to discuss your feelings, I'm here to explain systemic racism, like that's more difficult to do in that kind of situation. So it was super interesting when we were looking at like the design of the questions and how that kind of constrained what the answer was able to do. And then the person who was answering, even though they felt really strongly about systemic racism, kind of had to be like, well, it's okay to the host, and then talk a little bit about systemic racism, but in less of a strong way, less of a direct, it's a bad way than they would have been able to if it was like a different phrasing of the question. So yeah, I don't know. It's super interesting when you were talking about it. I was like, yeah, the way questions are phrased and the kinds of expected norms for if you're in a media context and it's not one of conflict, if it's one, then you have to manage that.
Now you make me wonder if I've been too defensive. I hope not. It's always tough to have these conversations that are not structured so much and collaborative, where there's a sharing, trying to find those beautiful questions that give as much as they ask, that get beneath the surface and get me out of the way to stimulate a real conversation. This radio program and podcast is called The Conversation Lab. I'm Don Schaefer, and today we're speaking with Natasha Shrikant. We had talked earlier about a paper you wrote where you said okay as a second position preface, that okay is not okay in some places.
So words like okay or yeah or uh-huh or even like are often dismissed as maybe verbal fillers or like not necessary for conversations. Aside, I guess, okay, if you just say, yeah, I'm okay, or yes, that's okay with me, but people often use it as a filler in different ways. But if you actually map out the ways that we use all those terms, we use them for a reason, to organize our conversation in certain ways, to signal certain things to the other person. So the paper that I did with a couple of colleagues on okay was looking at it when in question answer situations and conversations, when someone asks a question, but then there's something wrong about the premise of the question. So the person answering usually says, okay, and then kind of takes a step back to rephrase parts of the question. So I think one of the examples that we're looking at was someone asked, oh, like what score do you need to get into law school? And the person answering is like, okay, well, so if I go to this school, then it's this score. But then if I go to that school, they want that score. And so it's just, I guess the question was phrased as if there's one score across the board. What is that score? How do you get into law school? And the person answering says, no, okay, well, actually, it's a bunch of things. Because otherwise the expected answer would just be the name of the score, right? And so the person answering kind of uses okay to signal that there's going to be more than just one score, and then goes on and lists different things. So we had like several different examples where okay kind of signals, I'm going to be talking a little bit longer. And then throughout the answer, you could see them rephrase or kind of correct some sort of assumption that was in the question. So it's kind of cool how little words do a lot of that work. And you can see, because when someone says okay, the other person listens for a while. They don't start talking again because they recognize, oh, that person's going to be talking for a little bit now. And
do you think we consciously recognize those cues, or is it an unconscious process?
So conscious and unconscious are so from a communication perspective and from a social interaction perspective, people would argue it's conscious. Like, now, would you be able to later name it and say it's because they said okay that I knew this? Probably not. But people who studied this have like recorded hours and hours and hours and hours of conversations among just people on the phone, people talking to their doctor, friends chatting in different places. And they found all of these instances of okay. And they were able to show that like the person responding after, like, recognizes what this means. The person responding after recognizes it. And you can see that the person understands it because they choose to talk or not talk, or the things they say display that they've recognized the strategy from the person before. So conscious would be the short answer. And you can see it through the ways people respond in conversation.
So for our audience, is there a map, or are there cues that you can give us that change the way we enter a conversation?
I guess something generally I find useful is the notion of face work. And it's this idea that when we're communicating with one another, we try and maintain face, which is like a positive image for ourselves or for the other person. Like oftentimes we help the other person like not feel embarrassed or something like that too, right? Oftentimes the choices we make in conversation tend to angle towards like, we all want to be positively preserved. We don't want to have any sorts of other, but there are some conversations that are by nature face threatening. So I really like some of Karen Tracy's work where she looks at conflict in institutional contexts. And, she did some work with school boards where there was a norm of reasonable hostility, where being hostile at a school board meeting when you're advocating for your children or, was seen as a reasonable thing to do, even though it was very face threatening. And so I guess, when I think about conversations about racism, a lot of the reasons people deny or try and get around on an interpersonal level has to do with saving face and seeming like a good person and seeming like a well-intentioned person and things like that. And a lot of the reasons that maybe those of us who see racism happening don't call it out is because of face, because we don't want to seem like the angry person that's calling everybody out all the time.